All right. Most of you can probably tell that I am not Rhoda Au. And Rhoda, who is one of the MPIs for this project for the U54, unfortunately could not be with us today. And I'm Jim Péter. I will serve as the moderator for this panel. And I just want to explain the logic of what the next three presentations will be doing. The question of both explaining what the population prevalence of Alzheimer's and ADRD is, of course, a fundamental question, but there are differences between the underlying true state of the population and what we measure in the population. So these three presentations are going to start from the question, what are some of the fundamental determinants of the rate of cognitive decline and the incidence of cognitive impairment in the population? And Brian Beach, who's at Vanderbilt in the economics department, will be talking about one of the key drivers, which is exposure to lead. And we know that lead exposure is correlated with cognitive loss throughout the life cycle. And he'll be describing a project which is one of the research projects supported by the U54 grant, which will explain that. Second question is going to be, how can we actually do measurement at the physician or the doctor's office level of trying to identify the incidence of cognitive impairment? And for that, Michelle Mielke from Wake Forest will be talking about work on using blood tests as a way of trying to identify population circumstances and patient condition, cutting edge work on trying to simplify diagnosis and understanding what we can and cannot pick up. And then third, Péter Hudomiet from RAND, who is another one of the researchers who's supported by the U54 project, is going to be talking about different measures that we have in the population of the various rates of dementia that we measure and accuracy, in particular in Medicare data, of what we know about the incidence of dementia and associated diagnoses. So we're going to work our way through those presentations in that order, and I will ask you all to hold your questions, and we'll then open up for Q&A at the end. So Brian, lead off.
Okay, thank you. My name is Brian Beach. As Jim said, I'm an associate professor at Vanderbilt Economics, and I'd say it's equally exciting and terrifying to be up here talking to all of you about this new research program that I'm starting, both with Joe Ferry and Martin Saavedra, who are here, also economists, as well as our fourth co-author, Aaron Rubin, a psychologist at UVA who couldn't attend because of a travel conflict. So this presentation will be a little bit different in that this is sort of a new project that we're starting, so we don't have a lot of sort of finalized results that we can show you today. But the things that I want you to be thinking about that I'm going to try and discuss throughout the presentation is sort of the big idea that got us to team up and pursue this project. We're interested in this idea that, when we see these ADRD diagnoses, that ADRD might actually be sort of this measurable component of cognitive decline that actually starts many decades earlier, perhaps even in early childhood. And so we're going to be discussing, well, what might actually cause that. And one of our ideas is that early childhood exposure to lead might actually be setting off this process. And so then I'll end up sort of discussing like the literature related to that, and then introducing sort of our empirical approach or research design, which we actually think, should we be able to test these hypotheses, and if everything works out correctly, that we actually might have a framework that might be relevant for many of the scholars in this room for trying to understand sort of the burden that an ADRD diagnosis places on the family, as well as how that might interact with existing policies. So this is probably a well-known figure to you, and basically what we see here is these projections about the number of individuals that we expect to be living with ADRD in the United States by year. What you can see is that it's increasing sort of rapidly. These projections go out to 2060. And, we already had a discussion a little bit earlier in terms of what is the true ADRD burden. And so we think of these things like lower quality of life, the formal caregiving demands, informal caregiving demands, Medicare payments, and you might even expect there to be some disability payments as well. Now, one of the things that we sort of recognize, and there was an earlier discussion, is that these numbers are, of course, wrong, right? These are projections, right? And why might these numbers be wrong? Well, we have to make a number of assumptions to try and identify, what we think the true cost of informal caregiving demand is. But then we also struggle, and I think the fellow panelists will talk about this as well, that there are these diagnostic errors. So there are individuals that may be suffering from ADRD that we're not formally diagnosing, and others that we might be misdiagnosing. And then the third thing that is relevant is that actually there's evidence that the prevalence of ADRD risk is actually changing over time. And so then that feeds into these projections as well. And so this is an idea that recently reappeared from Eric Stallard and co-authors, which basically goes through and plots the cohort-specific ADRD rates by age, right? So we're going to be using different survey data, and what you can see is that the prevalence is actually falling over time. And I think the estimate is that the age-specific ADRD prevalence has fallen by about 2/3 over the last 40 years. And so that, of course, is some good news, especially in light of the presentations that we've seen thus far. However, it is an open question as to whether that decline is going to continue over time, whether it might lose steam, or whether it might improve. And of course, the answer to that question is relevant for trying to understand and make these projections. But the reason that we don't fully understand how that prevalence is going to change is that we don't necessarily understand what's causing that decline. And so what our project is doing is trying to basically provide some information that might help answer that question. And what we do is revisit sort of a longstanding hypothesis, which is that childhood exposure to lead might actually explain these trends. And so here I just plot some marketing materials related to lead use throughout the 20th century. And so what we know is that lead was most prominently used in gasoline, it was used in paint, and it was used in plumbing as well. And these decisions were not completely misguided. There were a lot of consumer benefits, reducing engine knock, or if you sort of share my weird hobby for DIY renovations, you'll find no shortage of old timers that tend to complain about how the new solder or the new paint just doesn't quite offer the same protections. But what we now know, of course, is that lead is this neurotoxicant, and that is not good for humans. Now, just to show you some of the progress that has been made, and so what we can see here, I'm plotting estimates of the consumption of leaded gasoline in the United States. And then in the red line, what we actually are plotting is the childhood blood lead levels. And what we recognize is that basically at the peak of leaded gasoline consumption, you had blood lead levels that were 3 to 4 times what the current recommended or current level of concern is, which is about 3 micrograms per hectoliter. And so what we see is that as we had phased out leaded gasoline, there's been actually this rapid decline in childhood blood lead levels. Now, that I think is sort of a policy success. Now, why might it be relevant for cognition? Well, what we recognize is that once lead enters the body, it sort of has some of these same properties as calcium, and it ends up finding itself lodged in these synapses where the calcium is needed. And in turn, we think that that's going to be lowering cognition and diminishing sort of this prefrontal cortex functioning, impulse control, and so on and so forth. And there are quite a few studies that have shed light on this question, too many to cite. But what we basically can find, there's no shortage of evidence that children with high lead exposures exhibit, decreased cognitive ability, fine motor skills, emotional behavioral regulation capacity, and that adults with a history of childhood lead exposure also show lower cognition, mental health problems, and biological aging. Now, from an economics perspective, right, we would talk about how a lot of these studies are a little bit more correlational, and the number one concern in terms of confounding factor is that a lot of these legacy exposures to lead are correlated with other things that might affect ADRD risk. So if you were thinking about exposure to air pollution through leaded gasoline, that's going to be correlated with whether you live close to a highway, which is going to be correlated with parental socioeconomic status. It's going to be tied up with the types of schools that you go to and the peers that you interact with as well. And so many scholars have tried to basically disentangle, is this just a correlation, or is it actually this causal effect of exposure to lead on these decreased cognition and so on and so forth. And so what I want to do is actually just talk a little bit about one study, which is the Dunedin cohort study. What we like about the Dunedin cohort study, and this I think ties into Jay's earlier point about pro-social behavior, is that basically it was a study designed to follow 1,037 children from one cohort, and it has a really high response rate. And so over the next 50 years, you can see that we're actually still getting responses on the order of about 96% of those that survive. And relevant for us is that there are a number of tests or subsamples where they're measuring IQ, both in early childhood as well as later in life. And then there were actually some blood lead levels taken. That, of course, had the lowest response rate because children don't like needles. And so we still have a sample of about 579 individuals. But then in the 2017 to 2019 wave, we actually also had some MRI imaging done. And so we can actually take a look at their brains. So the first useful feature is that if you were to plot measures of socioeconomic status against the blood lead levels, there's actually no correlation between blood lead levels and socioeconomic status, which eases these concerns about these potential confounding factors. Now, if we want to look at cognitive outcomes, we see that there are these correlations between the blood lead levels and lower cognition. But on the left, what I'm actually plotting here in the lighter bars is the change in IQ between childhood and age 38. And then the darker bars are going to be at age 45. And what you can see, the x-axis moves from the lowest level of lead exposure to the highest level of lead exposure. And there appears to be this gradient, which is just to say that individuals with greater exposure show lower cognition or greater declines in cognition. And if anything, it looks like it might be increasing, that slope might be increasing over time. In the right-hand panel, you might say, what's a few IQ points here or there? We're actually looking at the change in socioeconomic status between your parental background and your own background. And what we see is a very similar relationship, which is just to say that children with greater lead exposure are in these worse occupations. And if we look at their brains, which we saw at about age 45, we see that these children that had more exposure to lead show lower gray matter integrity, which is associated with speech, decision-making, and other higher order processes, lower white matter integrity, which is information processing, working memory, overall intelligence. And then in general, the brains were smaller and sort of older looking. And so it appears that there is this relationship between childhood lead exposure and the aging of the brain. So with my last few minutes, where do we enter? So what we want to do is basically take this idea that lead is related to decreased in cognition, a process that starts early in life and extends throughout the rest of the lifespan. But we don't want to wait another 15 or 20 years where we might start to see these ADRD diagnoses from the Dunedin study. We would like to have the answers a little bit sooner than later. So this is the figure that basically motivated our study. And so what we did is we took data from the American Community Survey, which asks individuals if they have basically an emotional or physical or mental problem that is associated with severe cognitive decline, so affecting their performance in school or work. And these are this is data that's from 2005 to 2022, and we just pool all of the cross-sectional data, and we have about 2.6 million observations. And in the blue line is the share of respondents in cities that have a legacy of using lead service lines that report having a severe cognitive impairment. And the red line is that same outcome measure, but in cities that don't have a legacy of using lead service lines. And what we see is that there actually is this gap between these two cities that emerges as early as age 5. But then by about age 70, the gap goes away. This is something that we're trying to explore at the moment. It could be an artifact of using cross-sectional data. So there might be things like migration or mortality that are biasing these estimates. But it also could be that this measure is just sort of a coarse measure of cognition, and that later in life, sort of the added effect of early life exposure to lead is just harder to pick up. Now, the things that I want you to keep in mind is that some of these birth cohorts are the 2000 to 2010 birth cohorts. So this is an ongoing problem. And just to give you a little sense as to how much of an ongoing problem, this is EPA data on lead service lines in communities across the United States. And that dark red area, those are going to be communities that have a median reported that like 70% of households are still using lead service lines. So this is an ongoing threat. Now, what do we want to do? Running out of time. So what we're looking at historical lead exposure, because similar to the Dunedin study, we think that historical exposure to waterborne lead shouldn't be related to socioeconomic status. In fact, if you sort of read the Great Lead Water Pipe Disaster, which I highly recommend, one of the main takeaways from that is that the exact amount of lead that you're actually exposed to is influenced by the chemistry of the water that runs through those pipes. And so to illustrate that point, what I'm plotting is our measure of lead solubility, which uses modern water chemistry models, against pH, which is sort of the commonly taken proxy for lead exposure. And you see that there's a lot of variation in lead solubility, even for cities that have the exact same pH level. And so this is a figure that we put together for about 200 cities, but we've been digitizing historical water chemistry data and expect to have a sample of about 2,000 cities covering about 90% of the urban population. And our goal is just to use that variation in lead solubility to try and isolate the effect of lead exposure on cognition. The idea being that you have individuals that grew up in 2 cities that both used lead service lines, but one had more exposure to lead because of the underlying solubility. And the benefit relative to some of the literature is that since we're moving beyond this pH, which has been very useful for establishing sign and significance, but we now have this measure of actual lead solubility, and we can try and back out the full amount of the dosing that individuals were exposed to, which will then allow us to do a few things, primarily estimating the contribution of waterborne lead to cognitive decline throughout the lifespan. We hope to be able to gain access to Medicare data to explore actual ADRD incidents. And then all of this should allow us to update these cohort level estimates of ADRD risk based on knowledge of pre-existing lead exposures. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We will have a quiz at the end on the how much of your high school chemistry do you remember about where calcium and lead fall in the periodic table as we go along. So, Michelle, thank you.
Great. Well, I'd really like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to be here today. My disclosure slide is next, but the biggest disclosure is that I'm an epidemiologist. And so I've been learning a whole lot today and really appreciate being here. These are my disclosures. So we know that cognitive impairment is very common in older adults. Based on the Health and Retirement study, approximate of those 65 years and older, approximately 22% had mild cognitive impairment and another 10% were diagnosed with dementia. Now, I come from the Alzheimer's field, but certainly with cognitive impairment, there are a lot of causes. It could be Alzheimer's disease, could be due to vascular changes in the brain, other types of dementias, but in older adults to who have multiple chronic conditions, medications, substance use, depression. There are really multiple causes of cognitive impairment. And so it's important to identify cognitive impairment as a first step, and then later on determine the etiology. Now, because of this complexity, it is difficult to diagnose cognitive impairment and dementia, as well as the etiology and who might progress in primary care. It has been estimated that up to 50% of individuals with dementia are not correctly identified in primary care, and this may be even higher among those individuals that have mild cognitive impairment. And certainly a main reason for this, there has been discussions of potentially screening all elderly 65 and older, but really in primary care, as was mentioned earlier, there's really very limited time. And one might think about the wellness visits, but Dr. Anshadi and Jennifer Gabbard and I had recently published a paper showing that those individuals who are older and have multiple chronic conditions are less likely to receive screening and attend the wellness visits. And those are the individuals that are really at highest risk of cognitive impairment and dementia. So to compound all of this, there's a limited capacity of dementia-related specialists, whether geriatricians, psychiatrists, neurologists, and others. And so the vast majority of the diagnosis, treatment, care, and follow-up will need to be done in primary care, just because the wait time would be too great for a neurologist. In line with this, I think the Preventive Care Task Force does not currently address cognitive screening or promote cognitive screening, but it is important to diagnose cognitive impairment early. Certainly at the forefront, again, in the Alzheimer's field is the idea of monoclonal antibodies. Ultimately, this is going to be a very, very small % of individuals. But there is a lot more research showing other things that can be done in terms of control of hypertension, reducing medications that can contribute to cognitive impairment, correcting for depression, substance abuse, and sleep. But the question is, how do we detect cognitive impairment at the population level? And how do we do this in an efficient way that is also reimbursable? So certainly much of my research has focused on blood-based biomarkers. And as of a couple of weeks ago, the first blood-based biomarker was FDA approved, Fujira Bio. So that might help determine the etiology. However, we do know that, well, right now there's a lot of discussion on blood-based biomarkers for screening purposes like this cholesterol test. Even though I do a lot of work in this field, I do not endorse that opinion. And we do also know that if individuals have a positive biomarker in their medical record and they are cognitively unimpaired, they are at risk for not obtaining life insurance, long-term care insurance, and disability insurance. So there's really a major need to objectively confirm cognitive impairment, and we make sure that we do that in the pathway. But again, how are we going to do that? Who, when, where, what, why? A ton of questions in terms of figuring this out. So this has led other PIs on the project, Jeff Williamson, who's a geriatrician, and Suzanne Kraft, who's a neuropsychologist. We've been working on what's called the MindCare 365, and we've got a whole host of reasons why it's 365 and not 360, which itself was trademarked, but that's another story. So when we started out, we had three basic principles. First, when you talk to primary care physicians, and they were heavily embedded in all of our progress throughout this pathway, it's really, you add any burden, even 5 minutes can be too much. So how can we have limited to no additional burden to primary care providers? Secondly, it has to be reimbursable throughout the entire pathway. If it's not reimbursable, it's not going to happen. And on a side note, our healthcare system can not lose a lot of money on it, which is always another factor. And then third, it has to be scalable. And WAKE is now part of the Advocate healthcare system, which covers about 6 million patients that are seen a year across 6 states in the Southeast and the Midwest. So our CEO is heavily invested and supportive of this, but we have to find something that will work for both rural and urban communities in the Southeast as well as the Midwest. And notably, it has to fit within the current workflow. So a little bit of a daunting task. And so this is an overview of what our pathway looks like. We're now at about 40 to 50 primary care providers. Primary care clinics, more providers within North Carolina, and we're growing as we talk. This is not the end all be all. We've had a lot of changes in this as we've gone along, so don't take it as exact step by step. A key component of this, first of all, was to identify, again, those individuals with cognitive impairment, regardless of etiology. But then we also wanted to make sure that we didn't say, okay, well, you've got cognitive impairment. Sorry, there's nothing we can do for you. So trying to build in other aspects of brain health that can help towards the end. We have started right now. So in terms of entryway into the pathway, there are two ways that we initially thought about it. One was an EHR algorithm trying to identify those individuals that were at highest risk. So you're not screening everybody, you're screening those at highest risk. And in our EPIC EHR, we currently have an e-frailty index. And so kind of something similar to that. Secondly is through self-family or physician report. Now, to date, we've only focused on self-family and physician report because if you look within just our triad area, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, High Point area, there's about 40,000 people that would be considered high risk based on our EHR algorithm. And obviously that would completely overwhelm the system. So that's something we're trying to get to down the road. So there's a memory concern in EPIC right now. We have an order called MindCare 365. Primary care will put that order in, and then basically it goes from there to APPs and is taken out of the hand of primary care. APPs then follow up with the patient. They do a more thorough history in terms of potential causes of cognitive impairment, sleep, depression, substance use, kind of other aspects, and they schedule them for a cognitive visit. Now, the cognitive visit has, we're on our third try with that. Originally, we started in the clinic. There were a couple issues. One that PCPs came back to us and said, well, this is okay, it's reimbursable, but it's not as reimbursable as other patients. Can you find something or another way to do this? And so we currently do at-home telephone cognitive testing, which is based off of many years of clinical trials that have been run out of Wake Forest. So that includes the TICSAM, the telephone MOCA, wordless learning, as well as fluency. If individuals come back, they're cognitively unimpaired, they're typically followed up put in the system to be followed up for a year for potential another test or checked in. If those individuals are found to be cognitively impaired, they go on to a blood test. Well, they have the opportunity to go on to a blood test and an MRI. And then the results of those and the patient's wishes really determine what their ultimate pathway is. So those that do come back positive on the blood test, they have low cerebrovascular disease, they may be eligible for lecanemab. They do have the opportunity to go on and have an amyloid PET or an LP, depending on their insurance status. There's many people certainly that are not eligible or not interested and also are not amyloid positive. And so for those individuals, if they need to see, or it's felt that they need to see a neurologist and will gain from seeing the neurologist, they are referred. Otherwise, there's a variety of other brain health pathways. We do have reimbursement for a coach to help with various aspects. And then also the APP will report back to the PCP and say, okay, this person has uncontrolled hypertension. There was a lot of concern for sleep. They hadn't been worked up. We've ordered a sleep test to try and guide the physician or to take, consider these medications. You may want to reduce these because they may be causing cognitive impairment. Now, we started this with funding from the Alzheimer's Association, and so we do have a little bit of research built in along the way in terms of testing out our telephone battery, understanding what the accuracy of the blood marker is. So we are doing more amyloid PETs. But we also have funding from the Davos Alzheimer's Collaborative. And so we started with in Winston-Salem with Davos. We have taken it now to Greensboro and High Point and some of the surrounding areas. So that's completely pragmatic without any of these other aspects built in. These numbers are a little bit old. We've got over 500 people where the order have been placed today. This was as of about beginning of March. So a couple things, of the 268, we do have about 10 to 15% of those that are referred to the Mind Care pathway that just decide they don't want to participate in it. We do have some people, I think we're up to about 5 people who go through, they have the cognitive assessment, decide that they don't want to know anymore. They don't want to understand etiology, blood tests, MRI, anything like that. Then they don't go any further as well. We did have 232 here that had cognitive testing, MRI, and the blood biomarker. And as you can see, their average age of 75, about 55% female. Now, I do want to say that this is not the age education is not representative of our area. And the reason for that is because when we started out the pathway, certainly there's a lot of lost trust with some groups with less health literacy, underrepresented groups. And so we wanted to do it actually with Jeff Williamson's practice, as well as some other practice on those patients that were already enrolled, that were already followed, because we had to make a lot of changes, and we didn't want to start with underrepresented groups and then make all these changes and try and figure this out on the fly. So although we have an average age or average education of 15 years here, I'm sure that's reduced now, closer to probably 13. Another thing with Alzheimer's disease and looking at these blood biomarkers, most has been done on younger adults and those with few chronic conditions. So as you can note here, average number of medications were 15 and chronic conditions were 24. Now, this is a little bit inflated. This was pulled directly from the EHR. And as you know, in the EHR with chronic conditions, there can be a whole host of various things. Same thing with medications. They may not currently be active or currently be taking it. But I think it is more representative of primary care. And we do have a couple medical students and graduate students this year that are going through the medical record. So we'll have a much better estimate. Of those that have come through, about 40%, and this is consistent to date, have been determined to be cognitively normal. We have about another 40% that are estimated to have mild cognitive impairment. And then the rest have dementia, either early dementia, moderate dementia, or we've had some late dementia as well. So with these individuals, we can refer them on to the GUIDE program. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of my work has been focused on blood-based biomarkers. And one aspect of this that I've been working on is to try and understand the accuracy, the use of blood-based biomarkers. And so when we first started out with our Alzheimer's Association proposal, the only blood bio or p-tau217, which we think is the most accurate blood-based biomarker, was only available with Neurocode and with ALZpath. And so that's what we're showing here. We have switched over to LabCorp Fuji p-tau217 because that's within our system. So it works a lot better with couriers. But we are also switching over to the new FDA approved tests. I think there's a couple of things that you can see here, and this will be similar to Fuji Bio, where you have 2 cut points, so a low, intermediate, and high. And the idea is that if you're low, you don't have Alzheimer's disease, no need to go on to any testing. If you're high, you have Alzheimer's disease, you don't need that confirmatory CSF or PET testing, and it's those individuals in an intermediate range that should receive it. Now, I think as you can see from here, we do have several false positives in the high range, and a lot of these individuals end up having chronic kidney disease, and that's causing increases in their levels. But we're also finding reasons, other reasons as well, and are looking through the medical record for discrepant results. So maybe not as accurate as what the literature would say, and certainly in our health system, for anybody that's going to go on to the monoclonal antibodies, they have to have confirmation of CSF or PET for amyloid positivity. So in conclusion, primary care has a critical role in the diagnosis of cognitive impairment as well as determination of etiology. Certainly, it's challenging to develop a system that will work, that's reimbursable, that's efficient, and will not necessarily overly increase burden on primary care. So far, we've have a lot of good feedback from our primary care physicians with this, and we are going to continue to move it throughout the health system as we develop more APPs. And that has been a big advantage for us in terms of the use of APPs with taking it out of primary care. Just had one slide on the blood-based biomarkers. I think they can help assess etiology in primary care, but again, a lot that we still need to learn, particularly in terms of accuracy in these real-world cohorts. Again, I just want to thank Suzanne Kraft and Jeff Williamson, as well as more people than I can name that have helped to move this forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, and third is Peter talking about the Medicare claims accuracy. Yep.
Yes, thank you very much for having me. Glad to be here to talk about disparities in the accuracy of claims-based dementia classifications in Medicare data. As you probably know, in administrative data sets, dementia is often diagnosed with errors. So many cases get undiagnosed, and we also have false positives. And recent and growing literature found evidence that these diagnostic errors are significantly larger among racial and ethnic minority groups. But we're going to challenge those results today. So that's where we're heading. But in any event, understanding these diagnostic errors is very important because it can lead to delays in care and underestimation of the healthcare costs of dementia or other diseases. There are multiple dementia classifications that exist in Medicare fee-for-service data, and each have their own drawbacks, and we don't really know which measures are the best to use. And even less is known about how to classify individuals into dementia versus no dementia in Medicare Advantage data. And so today, the goal of this talk is to evaluate the accuracy of claim-based dementia classification in Medicare data and studying disparities by age, sex, race and ethnicity, and other dimensions. But our project in the future will do other things as well. We are going to derive probabilistic dementia classifications that are hopefully better than the existing ones in fee-for-service data. And for the first time, we will do it in Medicare Advantage data as well. And we will study implications of diagnostic errors for healthcare utilization, costs, and mortality. So primarily today, I'm talking about the so-called chronic condition warehouse dementia classification and the 27 version of that. And only apply to fee-for-service data, but I'm going to show you a little bit of descriptive statistics on Medicare Advantage data. So there is a growing prior literature looking at these similar questions, and the main findings are summarized in 4 points. The first is that dementia prevalence used to be underestimated in claims data, but it's not underestimated anymore. So they are roughly correct. The second is that we have quite a few errors in Medicare data. About 50% of the people who have dementia have no corresponding dementia claims. So we're missing half of the cases. And the third is that there are many false positives, recently roughly equal amount of false positives. And the fourth one is that there are substantially more errors in racial and ethnic minority groups. And I'm going to show you that we're agreeing with the first 3 points and we're disagreeing with the fourth point. But first, let me talk to you about the data and our methods. So we're using the Health and Retirement Study, which is linked to Medicare fee-for-service and Medicare Advantage data, restricting the sample to individuals 65 years and older and who are enrolled in Medicare. And we look at the linkage rate, which is incredibly good. In the HRS, people had to actively consent to linking their data. It's not automatic. And yet we have roughly 95% link rate. Roughly 94% of HRS participants in this age range are enrolled in Medicare, and of them, 95% were successfully linked to Medicare data. So it's pretty amazing link rate. And the lowest one is among the youngest individuals in the most recent waves, where we have a slightly lower link rate. And that's because those individuals didn't have a chance to consent multiple times yet. They were only asked once. So the link rate will be better in the future. And we developed the weights to account for any non-randomness in this sample. And all the statistics that I'm showing you today are weighted. So the CCW27 dementia classification, it exists in Medicare data. It's based on ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes coming from 5 files: inpatient, outpatient, skilled nursing, home health, and career files. And what they are looking at is that they are, at the time of when they are measuring it, they are looking back for 3 years. That's this lookup window. And they are checking if there is any such dementia-related diagnosis codes within those 3 years. And after that, they classify individuals into one of 4 groups based on whether they were observed in fee-for-service data for 3 years or not, and whether there was any of these dementia codes or not. And then the prevalence of dementia is usually calculated by restricting the sample to those who were continuously enrolled in fee-for-service Medicare data, just to be more precise. And then they're checking the fraction who has these dementia codes. So there are many potential problems with the CCW algorithm. One is that people may just don't go to doctors, they don't get registered in the system, and their diagnosis is missing. The second one is that this list of ICD codes that the CCW is based on may not actually be accurate, and there are reasons to believe that some of them may not be accurate. And the third problem is that we have to restrict the sample to people who are continuously enrolled in traditional Medicare, and that might not be actually a representative sample. One issue could be that those who are newly enrolling in Medicare, they will be missing. We looked at it and we found that this is very rare in the sample. Most people sign up to Medicare very quickly after age 65, and those who don't, they tend to stay off of it. So almost everyone is continuously enrolled in Medicare. But we also looked at switching between fee-for-service and Medicare data, and we found that that's a much bigger problem. About 7% of the sample switch between Medicare Advantage and fee-for-service Medicare, and it's highly non-random. So going from traditional Medicare to Medicare Advantage is more likely among relatively low SCS but healthy individuals. And then when individuals get a new health condition, they switch back to fee-for-service Medicare. So the CCW algorithm is completely missing these switchers. So we think this is a problem, and that's why in the future we want to derive dementia classification Medicare Advantage data as well. But for convenience today, I'm not going to do that. We're restricting the sample to those who were continuously enrolled in Medicare for traditional Medicare for 3 years. Okay, so restricting the sample to age 65 and older, continuously enrolled in Medicare fee-for-service data. We recreated the CCW algorithm from raw data. We were successfully able to do that in 99.88% of the cases. And once we were able to do it, if we had the algorithm, then we applied it to the HRS interviews. So now we're taking individuals from the HRS and looking them back for 3 years and checking if they had any ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes with dementia diagnosis. And then I'm going to show you 3 statistics. The first one is so-called sensitivity. So that tells you that among those who actually have dementia, what fraction of them get a diagnosis in Medicare data. The specificity is defined as the polar opposite of that. Among those who don't have dementia, what's the probability that in the Medicare data that they actually don't have dementia? So they agree with that. And the third one is just the prediction accuracy. So when is it that the CCW algorithm is the correct one? And we want all 3 of these statistics to be high, like 100% would be the best for us. Now, in order to produce these statistics, we need to know true dementia rates. And so how to do that? It's not so easy. So in this project, we looked at 3 alternative ways. They all have some pros and cons. The first one is based on the so-called Adams data. In between 2001 and 2003, the HRS actually collected medical dementia diagnosis in a subsample of 856 people. So the main pro of this is that this is a very valid clinical dementia diagnosis. And the problem is that it's only available in one time point in a relatively small sample. So subgroup analysis is difficult to do. The second one is the so-called Langevin dementia measure, which is basically what the entire literature is using. The advantage of that is that it's available in a large sample basically for a very long time. And it's a relatively simple and transparent methodology. People answer questions to a few cognitive test items, and then there is a cutoff point calibrated to roughly match the true dementia rates from other sources. The problem is that it has errors already. So if we assume that that's the truth, then it's like not really fair to use this method to evaluate the CCW algorithm. And there is an even deeper problem that the recent literature found that the Langevin methodology substantially overpredicts dementia rates among racial minorities. And I'm going to show you that. And so there's a third method, which was based on our team developed it recently. It's a probabilistic dementia classification, similar to the Langevin measure, that it uses similar cognitive items, but it is calibrated to every subgroup so that it more correctly shows dementia rates within those subgroups. And because it's probabilistic, there are some statistical tricks that you can use to get sensitivity and specificity, even if you don't have like the actual truth. So this one is now coming from the Adams data versus the 2002 HRS, and it shows prevalence of dementia among non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic blacks. The blue bar is the Adams rate, which we think is highly accurate. It's based on clinical dementia diagnosis. The orange one is based on my group. This is our measure based on the HRS and this complicated model. And this roughly matches the Adams rates, both among non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic blacks. But the Langevin measure also matches the Adams rate among non-Hispanic whites, but it significantly overpredicts dementia rates among non-Hispanic blacks. And so this can actually bias estimates of sensitivity and specificity, which I will show you. So first, now still using the same data from 2002, let's compare estimates of sensitivity and specificity by the three methods. With Adams, we see that the prevalence of dementia is around 15%. These are individuals who are 71 years and older because that was the Adams sample. So it's 15% roughly. The sensitivity of the test is 49% roughly, which means that roughly half of the people who have dementia don't get a dementia diagnosis in Medicare data, based on the CCW algorithm. So we're missing half of the folks. And the specificity and the prediction accuracy of the test is larger. Now, if you look at the Langevin and R measure, you're actually getting pretty much the same numbers. So this is kind of good. Even though these measures have errors in them, they are not as accurate as the Adams classification, yet we recover basically these sensitivity, specificity, and accuracy measures. And you can also see that in 2002, the CCW algorithm underestimated the prevalence of dementia in the US by about 4 percentage points. Now let's look at subgroups. So this one is comparing men and women. On the left side, we show dementia prevalence. Women are more likely to live with dementia than men, partly because they live longer, but partly because they are more likely to get the disease. And if you look at the sensitivity of the test, is also significantly higher among women. So it means that women who have dementia are more likely to get a diagnosis in Medicare data, probably because they were more likely to go to doctors. And we know from the literature that women are more likely to go to doctors on average when they have problems. And so we show both our measure and the Langevin measure, and as you can see, they pretty much agree. So they are showing the same patterns between men and women. Now let's look at race and ethnicity, if I can go. By race and ethnicity. So now on the left side, based on our measure, the PRDM measure, we see that non-Hispanic blacks and Hispanic individuals are more likely to have dementia than non-Hispanic white individuals. With the Langevin measure, the gaps are much larger. And that's what I showed you before. The Langevin measure overpredicts the gap between these racial groups. Now let's look at the right side, sensitivity. What you see is that the sensitivity of the measure based on the Langevin measure is much smaller among minority groups, about 20 percentage points smaller. That's a huge difference. But if you use our measure, you see almost no difference between these groups. And so why is that? We think the main reason for that is that the Langevin measure overpredicts dementia rates. There are a bunch of these people who get, quote unquote, looks like they have dementia, but they don't. Then we go to Medicare data, look for a diagnosis. The diagnosis is not there. And then the method concludes that, well, the sensitivity of the test is lower among racial minority groups. But it's not. It's just that the measure that you used to calculate it was wrong. So that's the concern, at least. And so that's what our results imply. Now, I showed you that the sensitivity of the test was kind of low. Why is that? We also looked at sensitivity by other groups, and we found that it was actually pretty high among those who have severe dementia. And the problem is between the mild cases. So the mild cases are the ones that we are missing, and that sort of makes sense. Also, among younger people, it's more likely to miss a dementia diagnosis, and those who live in the community versus nursing homes. And then this is the final substantive result. So now we're showing trends in dementia using R measure. And this is similar to what Brian showed. The dementia prevalence has fallen over time quite substantially. At the same time, the CCW dementia classification shows an increasing trend. So basically, doctors are more likely to diagnose you with dementia more recently. And roughly recently, the two numbers are similar to each other. And because more people get a dementia diagnosis, the sensitivity of the test improved substantially. At the same time, the specificity of the test got worse over time. So we're making more false positives too. And the accuracy pretty much didn't change at all. And so the conclusion is that the CCW algorithm has moderate sensitivity, high specificity, and pretty decent accuracy. We found relatively little variation across SCS groups. And I think that the Langevin method that the literature has used before potentially underestimated the sensitivity in low SCS and also minority populations. And our next steps will be to evaluate other algorithms, such as the CCW30 algorithm and other similar algorithms, and also to derive dementia classifications in Medicare Advantage data and evaluate them. And thank you.
Great.